For those who will find it helpful, I'm going to read this document so you've got a spoken word version. How did the lives of peasants change after the Black Death? Begin by using the Cambridge Learner's Dictionary to insert the meanings of all the bolded words on your copy of this document. View this explanatory video now. So if you hit this link, it will explain how to use the Cambridge Learner's Dictionary to insert the definitions of these words. Question 1. Read the following source and use it to explain how the feudal system benefited lords more than peasants. Source 1. The Black Death of 1347 to 51 was one of the worst pandemics in Europe's history. It wiped out a lot of people, decimated the population, killing roughly half of all people living in Europe. After the ravages, the terrible destruction, of the plague were finished, however, medieval peasants found their lives and working conditions improved. Prior to the plague, before the plague, medieval peasants were often extremely poor and had few freedoms. Peasants typically farmed a portion of an estate land owned by a lord in return for the protection of that lord and the use of some of the land for their own food. But as a result, peasants were often tied to the land and had to give up certain freedoms to hold on to it. They also had to turn over a portion of their harvest, the crops that they took from the land that they grew, a portion of their harvest to the law as payment. This arrangement absolutely benefited the lord over the peasant. The lord was able to build up great wealth from the work of the peasant farmers. The peasants were often barely able to produce enough to get by and had few ways of increasing their wealth or improving their working conditions. So you're going to use the information here to explain how the feudal system benefited lords more than the peasants. So the lords were getting far more out of the feudal system than the peasants. The peasants, in other words, were used by the lords. Okay, question 2. Read source 2, explain how the Black Death created labour problems for lords. So the lords couldn't get enough workers. Explain how the Black Death increased the power of peasants. After the ravages, remember that means destruction. After the ravages of the Black Death were finished in Europe, however, there were suddenly far fewer people to farm the lands. Across Europe, crops remained unharvested, uncut, and great local landowners lost a great deal of money because they couldn't get anyone to do the work on their fields. As a consequence, labourers and farmers were in high demand. To maintain their estates, land, farms, and ways of living, the lords needed peasants to farm their lands, and so, faced with a labour shortage, the lords were forced to pay peasants more for their work and to enter into agreements that were more beneficial to the peasants than they ever had been before. Peasants suddenly had more control over their working lives. They could dictate, like force, the terms of their contracts, so they could tell the lords how it had to be, how long they would work, how much they would be paid. They could simply leave their position if their lord treated them poorly or was unwilling to pay them more. They were able to acquire, build up, more wealth and freedom as the importance of their labour was increasingly recognised. Okay, so not as many peasants. Peasants were in demand. The peasants had more power to say, well, unless you give me ABC, I will not work on your land. Question 3. How and why did the lifestyles of many peasants improve after the Black Death? Okay, so what we might do is just call this source 3. Just fix that up before I move on. As working conditions and salaries improved, so did the lifestyles of the peasants. Goods and activities that had only been available to those with money were suddenly being taken up by the peasants and other members of the lower classes. They used their newfound wealth to buy fancier clothes, eat nicer food, and take up leisure activities like hunting. Okay, so all the best with this task. I hope that's helpful to those who might need it.